So it's wonderful to see you all here. Terry, you're going to have the slides.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't recognize that you have a huge water quality problem in Owasco Lake, you ought to recognize that. It's not going to get better. So I'm going to go through a short presentation just to introduce you to the issues at hand, who I am, and then I'm going to beg you to get involved. And the key thing is you can go to toxicstargeting.com and click on the Algal Bloom link. And right at the top is a coalition letter. And I think we're just shy of 600 or 700 signatories. If we don't get 1,000, we're just not going to get anything done. So it's wonderful if you sign, but the key thing is you have to be force multipliers. You've got to go out and get more signatories.
The address is on your agenda, so it points you where to go on there. So please make sure this is a powerful tool in the anti-fracking Marcellus Shale process. So I encourage all of you to sign it and spread the word.
So as you're going to see, toxics targeting, by working with people like Terry and Jimmy, we're very, very unusual. Most people just sign petitions, we don't want this, that, or the other thing. And that very rarely succeeds. So toxics targeting understands the law, we understand the regulatory requirements. We have 40 years of experience dealing with local, state, and federal authorities. And that's how we can really work together, because we know what the law requires, and we have a lot of data that can drive awareness, and that's how Terry and I got enormous statewide press coverage just a couple of weeks ago. So against that background, so roughly almost 30 years ago, I married, believe it or not, a woman who was in the Bush family. And she couldn't believe I was a public interest lunatic and didn't have a car and was earning $26,000 a year. I realized I needed a better job. And so I spent all the money we had when we moved up to Ithaca so she could go to Cornell Law School, and I made this map. And so all I did was I took government data on toxic release inventory information and I mapped it. And with this one little map, I got $540,000 from the Rockefeller family, and I started my company, Toxics Targeting. So you can go to toxicstargeting.com and see what our company is all about. Next slide. So essentially what we now do in New York State is we compile information on 850,000 known and potential toxic sites. So we're what's called a geographic information systems firm. And so if you get one of our reports, it's only $150. If you click on a map ID number, next slide, well, this is a close-up view map. We have all these site remediation boundaries. So people use our data to check property transactions. Next slide. So if you just click on a map ID number, you can see that this Whole Food site, next slide, had naphthalene, lead, mercury, benzoate, pyrite. All we do is make it easy to get the government's own data. Next slide. So with our data, New York City, for example, checked where 500,000 people traditionally drank water from the ground in Queens, New York. This is the biggest report my company ever generated. We mapped and profiled 27,000 sites. Next slide. So you see the same thing. You just click on a map ID number and you can retrieve the site data. So this area had terrible groundwater contamination with a gasoline additive called MTBE. Next slide. And so then we can identify sites of interest and you can investigate them and remediate them. Next slide. And with my data, the city of New York sued ExxonMobil and won $104.7 million for polluting the drinking water for 500,000 plus people. Next slide. So that's the kind of the background of how you can get government data to identify water quality problems and, good Lord willing, do something about them. So in 1998, I started working on lake source cooling. So Cornell University wanted to suck up cold water from the depths of the lake about 250 feet down through these huge pipes. But an energetic group of local opponents insists that Cornell's $55 million plan to replace its aging air conditioners is actually an environmental nightmare. They say it could foster choking blooms of algae and bacteria at the south end of Cayuga Lake, and that's exactly what happened. So that cold water had phosphorus. So the issue you are dealing with in Owasco Lake, Skaneateles Lake, and Cayuga Lake, which had huge cyanobacteria blooms in August, is that the more phosphorus you add to these water bodies, that promotes the growth of algae and weeds. So the blue-green algae, they don't really call them blue-green algae anymore. They're actually cyanobacteria. They're prokaryotic cells. They're very, very primitive. But that's the issue. Our lakes have too much phosphorus. State and federal authorities know it, and they won't do anything about it. Next slide. So I hired this young scientist, Marshall Ballard, and he, as you'll see, he walked all the tributaries to the lake. And every time he found a wastewater discharge, a toxic dump, an eroded stream bank, he mapped it within 1 meter. Next slide. So this whole section of the lake is on 303D. It's a National Registry of Impaired Water Bodies. And it's supposed to get a TMDL, total maximum daily load. So the TMDL is supposed to figure out how much phosphorus can go into this segment of the lake without impairing its best use. Okay? It's a regulatory requirement. But we've been waiting since 2002 for our TMDL that's nowhere in sight. And I'm going to tell you why that is. Next slide. So here you have all the turbidity coming into the lake. You can already see we have a lot of algae and weeds. This phosphorus stuck to those suspended sediments. Next slide. You can also see there's a lot of algae and weeds over here. That's lake source cooling. So lake source cooling took the water from the bottom of the lake and dumped it into 9 to 12 feet of water, totally in the floating zone. It was like fertilizing your lawn. And as you see, it increased the production of algae and weeds by more than 50%, according to Cornell's own study. Next slide. So you can see this whole area is just inundated with algae and weeds. Next slide. So Terry mentioned the 20 part per billion guideline. This is for recreational best use. So this is so you can kayak and canoe and things like that. It's got nothing to do with drinking water. So all these areas had too much phosphorus, which even exceeded the 20 part per billion level circa 2001. It didn't help us get anything done. Next slide. So here's 2002, high priority for TMDL development. There's our lake. It's got too much phosphorus, silt and sediment from municipal discharges and non-point sources. So Cayuga Lake was originally designated as requiring verification in 1998 when we got into this huge fight. Requires verification is made up. It's not a statutory requirement. And that's how we just basically put enormous pressure on the state by working with EPA, and that's how we got it to be a high priority. But again, no TMDL, basically for these many years, since 2002. It's a political problem. Next slide. So we had this wonderful memo from circa 1998 about how our lake was impaired. Next slide. And so the narrative standard for phosphorus is extremely strict. Phosphorus shall be limited to none in amounts that will result in algae, weeds, and slimes that will impair the waters for their best usages. That's incredibly strict. Problem is it's never enforced. Same thing for silt. None that will cause deposition or impair the waters for their best usages. So the southern end of Cayuga Lake has a beautiful beach, Stewart Park. There's no swimming there for 50 years because a kid drowned in the muddy water, they couldn't find him. That's an impairment. There's no public bathing because of the water quality impairment. The problem is that these issues haven't been dealt with for decades. Next slide. In light of the project's significant water quality impacts and the probable illegality of the Speedies permit, State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, DEC should consider rescinding the permit. This was the lake source cooling discharge permit. It violated the key provision of the Federal Clean Water Act, which says you can't issue a discharge permit for a project that either through its construction or operation will cause or contribute to water quality violations. Seems very sensible, right? But that was never enforced. And that's the same problem Owasco Lake has, Seneca Lake, Skaneateles Lake. All these lakes have obvious water quality impairments, but the government is not dealing with them. The law is not being enforced. Next slide. Then to make matters worse, you're not going to believe this. EPA negotiated with the state and Cornell in secret and lied about it. We're not hiding anything from the public in our review process. Citizens Group has alleged that Cornell University has negotiated secretly with two government agencies over lake source cooling. Mary Mears is still at EPA. Next slide. I'm telling you this so you will have no misunderstanding about the challenge you face. This is from Ron Borsellino, EPA attorney, to Kathy Callahan, who is head of water quality planning. This afternoon I spoke with NG Call, he's with DEC, regarding meeting with DC, EPA, Cornell, and citizens. Call said that he did not want to meet with Walter Hong, it's actually Hang, at this time. He thought that you and he agreed to meet with Cornell and the two agencies first, then meet with the citizens when we have something to tell them about future non-point source programs. I then called Walter Hogg. I got his machine. I left a message we will be getting back to him with a response within a week or 10 days. Next slide. So they gave this draft Cornell review document. This was after we hammered them in the New York Times. The Howcraft, who was head of facilities for Cornell. Next slide. Same thing to Phil Degatano at DEC. Kathy would like your comments by tomorrow, June 22nd. Next slide. This agreement was amazingly great. Development of explicit criteria that would be used to determine if the project is causing adverse impacts, completion of an outfall relocation study. So if you extended the pipe to send the phosphorus back down to the bottom of the lake, no sunlight, no algae, no problem. And then development and implementation of projects to reduce diffuse loadings of phosphorus to the lake. The main focus of this effort will be to identify non-point sources or similar diffuse sources of phosphorus and to develop mitigation projects to control the sources. This project could serve as a model to test the concept of offsets, which is being discussed at the national level as a potential element of the permitting of new discharges to stress waters. So all across the country, lakes couldn't meet the national fishable, swimmable standard, even though all the point discharges had been controlled, because there was too much non-point source pollution just washing in after every rainstorm. So this was exactly what we wanted. Next slide. I heard from DEC and Cornell today they don't like our agreements. So basically, Cornell liked 2 out of 3, DEC didn't like any of them. Next slide. So now we're down to criteria, conduct a study, identify the role. Next slide. And the whole thing just got chopped into pieces and it was never adopted. Next slide. There is no protocol where non-point source pollution contributions are being used as an offset for any project in the country. So there was no consensus that doing it for lake source cooling was the right thing to do, says Lanny Joyce. Joyce said the 5 to 6% increase he meant in phosphorus had been discussed since 1995 when it was stated in the project's environmental impact statement. So they admitted that they were illegally contributing phosphorus to a water body that already had too much. But they refused to solve the problem because lake source cooling is the centerpiece of their sustainable energy project. Next slide. So then I started getting all these anonymous little notes telling me what was going on within the agency. It's like written with your left hand. Next slide. Then I found out the state of New York was actually offered hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a study for a TMDL analysis of the lake. EPA was dangling the money. Next slide. Just keep going. So you see, this is the draft. Next slide. All the issues were addressed. Next slide. Next slide. Monitoring the watershed, the lake. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Incredibly detailed. The day the draft application was due, DC didn't submit it. So they turned down the money to actually investigate the problem. Then my great buddy, a wonderful public servant, Pete Granis, got head of DC. I'm sorry it's taken so long for me to reply to your letter. I appreciate your wishes. I'm looking forward to working with you in my new capacity. I've always admired your zeal when it comes to environmental matters. Next slide. So he promised that we were going to work on the TMDL, but he got fired before that promise was fulfilled. Next slide. Meanwhile, the lake kept getting worse. Next slide. I mean, this is just an out-of-control situation. Next slide. And then Cornell tried to eliminate the monitoring, which was documenting the problem. So this was the area, Site 7, where the worst impairments were. And they tried to get rid of it. Unfortunately, we killed it. Next slide. And so you can see it's incredibly technically complicated to fight one of the biggest institutions in the state, in the nation. But we have survived, and we're finally going to get the TMDL. Next slide. So you get the idea. You have to be very technically sophisticated. There's like an army of engineers and scientists that were battling at Cornell. Next slide. Next slide. So then we finally got EC to say that they needed more data from Cornell. Next slide. And we're talking about this phosphorus, the form, it's like heroin for plants. For Zetang, who argues the lake source cooling is responsible for increasing algae. So they got to put the phosphorus back down the bottom lake. Next slide. But then Dick Draper retired, and so DC started backpedaling. Next slide. So you get the idea. Keep going. Next slide. Then finally we got them to do this study, which they tried to conduct. It's called the Before and After Control Impact Study. Next slide. And it showed there was a 50% increase at Site 7 in this Backey analysis. Next slide. Next slide. And this is that area. That's where Site 7 is. Next slide. How'd you like to have that in your front yard? Next slide. So the impairments have just gotten worse and worse and worse. Next slide. Next slide. And these are where we mapped all the sources of the pollution to the lake. Next slide. And so we gave these data to the state and the feds, but it was never adopted. Next slide. You can see the reservoirs are filled up with sediment. That's where the phosphorus attaches and it washes into the lake. Next slide. So there's almost no water in our reservoirs. You see all the eroded stream banks. Next slide. This is supposed to be an impoundment where the water comes in, slows down, and sediments all drop out of suspension. But it's all filled up with sediment, so it just fills up the reservoirs, goes into the lake. This has been going on for like 80 years. Next slide. So finally, after the state offered Cornell an opportunity to spend $3 million to prove that they weren't polluting the lake, their own study showed that they were contributing 6% of phosphorus to the lake. And this violates that key federal provision 122.4 paren I. Okay, next slide. So what you need and what we need is to figure out where all the pollution in the watershed originates so it can be cleaned up. It's as simple as that. Next slide. And the reason I'm here today, the reason we have this opportunity is because last year, Owasco Lake had a terrible problem. And he said we have to protect the drinking water first and foremost. And so far, you've succeeded. But now you're not the only one. So Skaneateles Lake has it, Hugo Lake has it, and more recently, since we did this, Seneca Lake has it. I think we're up to 68 harmful algal blooms. Next slide. And you can go through and check out how many reservoirs have this problem. And it's just mind-blowing that the state has failed to deal with these long-standing issues. Next slide. Next slide. And now this is the reality of where you're at. So this is 303D for right now. So if you get a little asterisk, you're scheduled for development in 2016. If you get a cross, you're scheduled sometime through 2022. Next slide. So your inlet is 2022 for nutrients, municipal, agricultural, and it was added in 2008. Problem is the Owasco Inlet doesn't really have very many problems, right? So here we are, Hugo Lake. So we're going through 2022. Okay, next slide. Now Owasco Lake has a deference. Water bodies for which DMDL development may be deferred requiring verification of impairment. But this is only for pathogens, for disease-causing agents. Next slide. This is the key issue. So this is another deferred TMDL development category. Year 2022, right? Owasco Lake. Unknown cause. Unknown suspected source. This listing is the result, this is 2016, this is what Terry was talking about. This is the official New York State designation. This listing is the result, frequent harmful algal blooms that impair recreational use and threaten drinking water supply use in the lake. So the threatened health requirement is 0.3 parts per billion. And last year, I believe you got up to 0.22.
In Owasco's, Auburn's got 0.1.
Okay, so you're very, very close. This is a part per billion. A part per billion is 1 second in 32 years. This is a shockingly low level. And as Terry said, you were a hair away from exceeding it. Listings for water bodies impaired due to harmful algal blooms are not listed with harmful algal blooms as the cause pollutant because harmful algal blooms is not a pollutant that can be regulated with a TMDL. That's totally not true. All of Hugo Lake is being regulated with a TMDL for phosphorus, right? More typically, listings of water bodies impaired by harmful algal blooms identify nutrients as the cause pollutant. However, in this case, the level of phosphorus in chlorophyll A is a measure of biological activity in algae and weeds, in the open lake waters are low. Well, as you saw, the problem really isn't in the open water, right? It's in the shallow water, where the phosphorus gets uptaken very quickly, are low and indicate that something other than nutrient eutrophication is driving the occurrence of harmful algal blooms. So eutrophication is basically where a lake, as it gets older, becomes more biologically productive, right? But basically, you got too much phosphorus, just like Hugo Lake. Therefore, until there is a better understanding of the cause of harmful algal blooms in this situation, the most appropriate place to list this water body is in Part 3B. With the cause/pollutant noted as unknown. So they're just putting you in the deep freeze, because they're not doing any investigation of your lake. So the first and foremost thing you've got to do is get Owasco Lake back in Part 1. And you need a TMDL within 2 years. And that's what our coalition letter requests. There's no benefit in delay. Next slide. So what would a TMDL involve? So this is the watershed, for example, for Skaneateles Lake. You can see all these different land uses. And what you need to do is to go to the entire watershed, and you got to find every source of pollution. And you have to mitigate it, and ultimately you have to eliminate it. You know you have too much phosphorus. You may have all sorts of other pollutants that you don't know about, but that's the bottom line. You need a comprehensive environmental assessment for the entire watershed. They haven't done it for Skaneateles, they haven't done it for Hugo Lake, and they certainly are not going to do it for Owasco Lake unless they face brutal pressure. It's as simple as that. Next slide. Here's the final thing. So you've heard that they want to do a 9-element plan versus the TMDL. So what's the difference? And this is key. A TMDL, this is according to DEC's own data that you can see on their website. Very complicated. A TMDL is a regulatory requirement for water bodies included in the National 303D Registry of Impaired Waters. You're not in the registry. You're in the requires verification subcategory. So you got 219 water bodies ahead of you. And between now and 2022, they're only going to deal with 15. So if you don't get cranking and build up brutal political pressure because your water is threatened, you're just never going to get your lake cleaned up while we're still around and young and can run. That's just the reality of it. So the TMDL restricts the amount of pollutants in order to assure compliance with water quality standards. And public comment is required. This is totally in contrast to the 9-element plan, which is a type of clean water plan that details a community's water quality concerns and a strategy to address these concerns. And the 9-element plan depends on what are called best management practices. This sounds great, right? Best. They're totally voluntary. No regulatory teeth, right? That's the critical difference. You could have a 9-element plan with endless meetings, communities involved, nothing ever happens. The TMDL, as Terry noted, has to be approved by EPA. It's a state development, it's a regulatory requirement. Next slide. Actually, go back one, sorry. So they're pretty much the same in theory. Identify all the sources of pollutants contributing to the water impairment, use all kinds of computer models, blah, blah, blah. Next slide. Determine how much each source should be reduced. That's really hard. You don't have enough data, you're not going to have a good TMDL. And then include an implementation plan. So the idea is to figure out how much pollution can you dump into the lake without impairing the best use. No one really knows how to do that. That's how come what you really want is you want to know where the pollution comes from, involving the phosphorus and the nitrogen and the other nutrients that are causing the impairment. You got to clean them up. They got to go. Because these problems have been known about for years, if not decades. Just no one ever attacked them. Next slide. And again, the 9-element plan is a strategy developed by people who live and work within the watershed with support, intended to ensure that the contributing causes and sources of non-point source pollution are identified, the key stakeholders are involved, and that restoration and protection strategies are identified, right? There's no requirement to actually solve the problem to meet the applicable standards. That's how come 9-element plan, death, in my view. TMDL, much better, but hard to achieve as well. Next slide. Next slide. So you can go to DC and you can read this yourself, but the terms are very complicated. So that's why I came here tonight to explain to you the differences. Next slide. Next slide. Compare. You're going to have to become issue experts, or you're not going to get your lakes problem solved. You don't get your lakes problem solved, you're not going to get your drinking water problem solved. For those of you who own property, you know, everything you work for is hanging by a thread. Next slide. Next slide. So here's the last thing I want to show you. How hard it is to overcome the polluters. So this was Jeff Myers, and he's in charge of developing the TMDL for Cayuga Lake. So Cornell wrote him to give him this Cayuga Lake Modeling Project report about the outfall redesign study. And they basically tried to take that issue off the table. And that's to send the phosphorus back down to the bottom of the lake. It's cold and dark, no algae. Next slide. So then you'll see DEC, to their credit, write this incredibly detailed rebuttal and pointed out that Cornell was supposed to identify a suitable location and depth for an extended outfall should that be the selected alternative at the conclusion of the TMDL study. This is what we fought for 19 years. Next slide. So you can see all of this very, very detailed engineering rebuttal, scientific rebuttal. Next slide. And then he retired. We're right back where we were with Dick Draper. And the woman who's dealing with our lake is dealing with your lake. So in conclusion, my view is we're all in this together. If you think you're going to get a fair shake from DEC and EPA without really, really pushing hard, you're not. I can tell you that from 19 years of bitter experience. But I think you have very, very good leadership here. And the most important thing is you have another crisis. So we have to use that crisis to good advantage. Because we've gotten a lot of press, now we have Skaneateles, now we have Seneca Lake, but if we can't unite behind that coalition letter at the top of Toxics Targeting's homepage, we're screwed. Because in about a couple of weeks, it's going to get cold, the biological activity is going to go down, this crisis is going to be a forgotten issue. So we have to strike hard, we have to work together now. If we don't, we'll be here another year, and you'll have the same issue. So I implore you, realize it's a political issue, take political action, get educated, work together, and work with the other lakes. If we can't get high net worth people to care about their investments, to care about the public good, we're just not going to get anywhere. We have 219 impaired water bodies. They've been ignored for decades. And it's because there's no program to solve these problems. We have a long way to go, but you're one of the strongest groups, right? And that's all I have to say. It's a political problem. We need a political solution. It's entirely doable. But if you rely on anyone else to do it for you, you're not going to be happy. You're not going to get a favorable outcome. That's my view. Please help me get more signatories to the coalition letter, because that's how we get press coverage. That's how we build political coalitions. That's how we can solve these problems. You care about your lake, you've got to solve the problem. Promises are not enough. Okay, thank you so much.